These days, everyone seems to be using technology in one way or another. Well, no, it's not an assumption. There is no seems. It's pretty much a fact by now. At this point in time, there are over 4 billion people who are using technology in the world. That is about 59, I think, percent of the population, which, to be fair, doesn't seem like much. But when we look at specific countries, we see that some of these countries, such as Iceland, the UAE, Kuwait, have an average of over 90% of their population using internet. And similarly, France, the US, and most other countries in that kind of economical situation have an average of about 85%. When looking at these numbers, you kind of realize that a world without technology is so unimaginable. Although, I mean, technology has really only become this popular in the past 2 decades or so. Of course, all this is just data, just numbers that don't necessarily mean that something's wrong or not. But when you look at our attention span and the change in our attention span over the last 2 decades, with the rise of technology, it seems to have dropped to almost 8 seconds, which many people have kind of joked about as saying, you know, we now have an attention span that's shorter than that of a goldfish. And I know that everyone is kind of tired of these statistics and that they don't really mean anything and you kind of like don't know what to do with it. And yes, maybe it's bad, but so what? And all these things, so like I don't want to dive too much into all of that. What I do want to kind of draw your attention to though is the fact that if back in the days when your parents or grandparents were teenagers, all the free time that they would use to read, we're now using to go on our phones. And research also backs this up because I think 67% of people from 18 to 24 say that they go on their phone whenever they have a moment of free time, compared to only 10% among the older generation. To be fair, I've never been a child who read. As a kid, I'd sometimes have my parents read to me, and then when I was a bit older, I'd, read whatever I needed to for school. But reading was never like my passion. I never spent hours and hours reading. So it's kind of surprising that over the past few years, I've managed to somehow like it. That being said, I actually haven't been reading that many books, or at least nowhere as many books as I would have wanted to. I sort of feel like the fact that I have been using social media and letting my brain get accustomed to the shorter attention span consumption habits is somehow responsible almost for the fact that I haven't read enough. Obviously, this isn't to point fingers, but rather to pinpoint a certain cause and effect factor, or at least a correlation between some circumstances with the situation. Regardless, this obviously isn't the most important part. And the main reason I'm bringing this up at all is that no matter how much I tell myself that I'm not like people in my generation, or I'm not affected by the same things as people in my generation, or that I don't have a short attention span, I think I'm definitely affected by this one, at least to some extent. All that said, I think I might have found a way to rewire my brain to work with me rather than against me in my shenanigans surrounding reading. To be 100% honest, I don't actually know how accurate the word rewire is in this context, but I definitely think that this could kind of be a hack towards getting yourself to sort of like increase your attention span as much as you physiologically still can. Because the whole stigma around it is that we just can't focus, but that's not true. Is that our dopamine is wired differently and we don't get pleasure from focusing for longer amounts of time. And that is the sort of loophole in all of this, and the solution is essentially linked to that specific factor. So, after going to the library to pick out one book, I come back with 3. We'll tone it down and keep it to 1 for now. I'm actually really excited about this one. I think I found it or heard of it for the first time on Pinterest, and I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover or title, but that's kind of how I picked some of my favorite books, so I think I'll steer away from following that advice, at least for the time being. This book is called How to Make Friends with the Dark. It's written by Kathleen Glasgow, and yeah, it's not the lightest book, but it is young adult fiction, and it seems to be kind of interesting, at least in my opinion. Dark, twisted, interesting. Well, I guess that is literally all you have to hear about my personality. That's it. Thank you very much. Bye. Here's the thing about my reading habits though. No matter how much I want to read a certain book, there's no actual proof that I'm gonna read it in the amount of time that it should take me to read it, if that makes sense. Let me elaborate. If we go back to the attention span, yes, it's true to some extent. it no longer comes naturally to me to sit down and just read 100 pages in one go. The reason for that is not that the book is not interesting or that I can't read fast enough, but rather the fact that I get distracted regardless of how interesting the story might be. Another habit that's kind of linked to this one but not really is that I can take a weekend and read like half of the book and then over the week not read it at all. There's no schedule and there's really no commitment to reading, so you kind of rely on the fact that your brain is going to think of the book whenever you have a moment to read it, and that honestly happens as often as it does not. There are probably a few more examples of my bad habits surrounding reading. However, I feel like this is a good time to get into the strategy that I found to work for myself. The problem with reading that I come across every single time is that I don't have enough patience to get myself into flow state. The downside of getting into flow state is that it takes time, and without patience, it seems like it's almost impossible to do. But here's what I've been doing for almost 3 years now. I make a graph, not to be all academic and boring or whatever, but that's what I find works best for me. And hear me out. First thing, you need to know how many pages your book has. In this case, this book has 420 pages, which is what I'm going to graph on the page axis. On the other axis, you're going to place the days that you give yourself to read. And so essentially, this is adaptable based on how much you think you can read or how fast you need the book to be read. And you kind of give yourself some days or weeks to read the book, graph the whole thing together, and you create your goal. So this is going to be an estimated line based on the amount of pages you have and the time that you want to take reading the book. You don't really specify how much you're going to read on every day, but rather make a line of estimate, so to say, in terms of how fast you're going to read the book. And then after that, you update the graph with the line that's going to represent the reality of how fast you're going to read, and you're either going to go faster than your estimated line or slower, and the goal is to meet the final point or sometimes surpass it. So achieve it, finish the book in less time. This works really well for me because I feel like when I kind of set a deadline or have a feasible goal for how fast I want to read a book, it almost creates a sort of self-assignment for yourself, which in my experience has been working really well for me. It kind of becomes a game, and you're trying to get yourself to stick to the goal and to overachieve your expectations, and it kind of makes reading an activity rather than a thing that I'm gonna do if I have time, if that makes sense. This method also works really well for anyone who has an actual assignment set to read a book. However, I also want to comment that this method potentially goes against the concept of like reading for pleasure or just not having it as something you have to do, but rather as something you want to do. I understand that for some people, having it graphed out might take away the leisure aspect of the activity. However, I feel like if you're someone who doesn't read a lot or doesn't have a habit of reading, this could be a potential way to give reading another chance and make it more fun for yourself, I guess. So if you feel like this is something that could be beneficial in your life or that you could try applying and could potentially change something in the way that you either read or don't read or whatever, consider giving it a try and let me know if it works for you. So whether you like reading or not, maybe try this out, because I guess in life you never know what you come across, and perhaps the best things are hidden in the things we try to steer away from. Don't know, just a theory. Thank you.